What I want to just give you an overview about is this idea and notion of emotional intelligence. And in terms of sport and the work that we do with sports coaches, and many of these coaches are the Olympic coaches, the high performance coaches. In netball, we don't have the Olympics, we've got the Commonwealth Games, so our coaches work to sort of being the best they can be in high performance at the World Cup or the Commonwealth Games themselves. And we were very, very keen to start to look at what real effective leadership looked like and what effective expert coaching looked like, what it needed to look like if it didn't meet the demands already. We chase an awful lot in terms of Southern Hemisphere in netball. We chase the Australians, the New Zealanders. They do an awful lot of work in and around building the leadership qualities of their coaches through business networking alongside the sport-specific education that they go through. We started to look at expertise, and there is an assumption that the expert coach is driven and knowledgeable in terms of the technical, the tactical, the physiological, the fitness and the psychology that goes with the performer. We carried out the research in and around our expert coaches, and all of a sudden everything flipped itself full circle to none of that was deemed to be the key characteristics of our expert coach at the top level. Yes, it was important, but they were items that weren't ranked highly. So it came as a bit of a shock to certainly the netball education coach development team. Likewise, it came and has come as a bit of a shock to equestrian and rowing, who we work with in terms of the training of their master coaches as well, who do work towards Olympic medals. So we found ourselves with this idea of emotional intelligence, starting to look at our coaches, and the offer that we had for them in terms of CPD was totally driven by the technical, the tactical, the sport-specific knowledge. And every piece of information coming back from the athletes, from the coaches themselves, from retrospective analysis of previous successful coaches, everything was saying to us that it was all about the level of emotional intelligence that these individuals can express. So I just wanted to share some of the work with you and where sort of I come from and our team come from in terms of building and working with coaches to develop emotional intelligence. And it's really in and around their ability to manage relationships and how they build their social sort of encounters, how they work really to actually develop the social skills, their interpersonal skills, their intrapersonal skills as coaches in terms of that self-awareness. So just a little bit of background before I delve into the practicalities of what we're actually doing in sport and how we're utilising some of the business research, but equally how sport is driving this emotional intelligence work forwards and building up the evidence base. This really is all about an individual's ability to manage their own feelings, but equally to be able to discriminate between them, to really identify emotional behaviour of themselves, of our coaches. For us, that's in and around pressure moments, critical incidents in and around an athlete building up to competition. It might be the coach that's developed a very poor win-loss record in the loss count, and how they actually start to handle themselves, but equally their ability then to start and read the emotions of other people and their fellow athletes, their fellow coaches, support staff that they might be working with. And we know that a coach's decision making is impacted by their level of emotional intelligence, and some of the work that maybe you've seen before, you may know that already. It's not always a given. People will often assume that decision making is a cognitive capacity, that an individual can actually make decisions through the level of intelligence in terms of IQ. But what we do know is that the EQ element is featuring in, and when we put our coaches in stressful situations, their self-reporting will tell us that it's their emotional intelligence level that is distinguishing between the more successful coach in managing those incidents compared to others. So we're starting to build up a kind of overview as to critical incidents of sports coaches operating at the cutting edge, when and where they really find themselves in those stressful pressure moments, and how their emotional intelligence is actually supporting them or impacting upon them in a negative way if it's not as developed as others. So what the research is telling us and what our work is telling us, that we need to continue, and it's a continuous cycle of working with our coaches in and around the scenarios to let them sense what their emotions are in incidents, present them with scenarios in terms of learning, to actually keep them engaged with their own thinking and the development of their own self-awareness. And I think there's a clear message there to any individual in a leadership position. It's remaining current, but continuing to check and challenge your level of emotional intelligence in a way that of looking at how you would handle certain situations. So our education and our coach development has almost flipped itself, as I've mentioned earlier, full circle, to start to work more closely with coaches in and around those daily dilemmas that they might face, particularly now with some coaches we're working with as they're building up to Rio, some of the rowing coaches that we do some mentoring with. A lot of their questions back to us are in and around relationships, not tapping into the level expected of one of the individuals that's rowing in the boats compared to the others that are working really hard, the other one seems to be disengaged, and so on. And often it's working with the coaches to start to read, what's that emotion, what's it look like? Is it your perception of their disengagement, and defining that emotion as disengagement? Because when we actually look at the rowers, speak to the rowers, or you look at their behaviour, they would not say they're disengaged. So we know that we've got some work to do with those coaches to look at the cause and effect element of those emotions that are being shown, and often at times they're being misinterpreted. So that's sort of where we're at. I don't think we know all the answers, but what we do know is that we need to continue to work with our coaches to present these scenarios as part of their CPD. This is the model that we use. Hopefully this just gives you an idea of where we come from in terms of emotional intelligence. It is levelled, so we say it's scaffolded in a sense that as you work from number 1 to 4, the level of emotional intelligence and the capacity increases. So a lot of our coaches, we would say, are operating in and around the second box. That they're using emotions to facilitate their thought. They recognise when they're under pressure, they can read their own emotions. They're starting to potentially read them in other people, but that they've got that awareness. But what we do find is that they potentially are not necessarily reading the emotions in the athletes in the correct way. Neither are they able to maybe predict the type of emotion that they would receive from their performers and their athletes. So what we're trying to do as they move through this kind of modelling, which is based on their ability to obviously read these emotions, is to actually get them to start to think about the management which comes at the end, in a sense of maybe trying to read what might happen, what an athlete's response might be to a certain situation, and almost start to manage that and prepare for it, as opposed to be reactive in a sense of what they might find, particularly under pressure, in competition, in a stressful situation. And a lot of the coaches that we work with will often say that their communication or their environment that they're working in with their athlete will break down, or has at times broken down in competition, with maybe all the support network, the strength and conditioning coaches, the sports psychologists that wrap around the athlete. So what our coaches are also saying to us, they're not just managing the emotions of the athlete that they're coaching, they're equally managing the input and the emotional responses of all those individuals that work around that person as well. So as much as they work to understand the athlete, what they're equally finding is they get to a point that the management of the emotion is also turning itself into fellow colleagues that are paid to work with that individual, and equally at times are impacting upon that emotional kind of environment that's being created. So we tend to work through this level of difficulty, and we're hoping as we get our coaches to the final stage, that they're able to start to regulate the moods of their athletes, of themselves, and equally they're understanding the cause and effect relationships of some of these emotional responses that they see within the climate. So we've got a fair bit of work to do. There are some naturals that we might say in terms of individuals that are so good at reading situations, they're so good at actually knowing what the impact of their behaviour is with certain individuals. And some of our coaches are able to modify their behaviour, same message, but modify how that's delivered to the different individuals. But others try and deliver in a one-size-fits-all capacity. And what we're finding is that won't necessarily always work and is not successful across the board. So we work with this model, and as I've said, it really is about starting to, in my opinion, for our coaches, starting to say to them, okay, you go in, you're placing demands on these athletes, you're pushing them because you're expected to win the medal. Look at that behaviour on them, particularly if they've been training every single morning, they've been on the water every single morning, they're training with a 2-hour break 3-4 times a day at the moment if we take the rowing groups leading in to the Olympics. How are you being perceived by them, and are there times when you maybe need to actually look at your behaviour and adapt it? And our coaches say, well, we're driven by a scientific programme, particularly rowing. We're asking them to, actually at times they may need to just read the individual. They may need to actually say to the athletes, actually, we're taking a 30-minute time out in terms of this training in physicality, and we're modifying what we do because either they're fatigued or they're just not necessarily coping with the stress and the strain of the training week. So we're really trying to work with those coaches to read those moments, those critical incidents, and I think this is the type of work that sport needs to do far much more analysis of, in a sense of what it really looks like and what we can learn from those major competitions as well. Some of the sort of simple categories that we use with coaches in and around their skill, their development is number one priority, that this is all about a coach's self-awareness, and emotional intelligence will develop incredibly well if our coaches are self-aware. And believe it or not, the majority of coaches in our system will go potentially 15 years before they really have come into contact with this idea about self-awareness, self-reflection. It's just been an add-on to an education programme. So I mentioned at the beginning, we've got to flip the learning from sports knowledge, specific knowledge in terms of technical, tactical and the components of performance, to really start to say we've got to focus more closely in and around the development of self-awareness. You talk to coaches and they will say, I'm self-aware. I'm sure you probably work with individuals, have employees that will say that they are reflective and they're self-aware. When you start to assess their behaviours, unfortunately, their actual behaviours don't match their perceptions. And this is where we're finding with some of our coaches that they'll talk to us about being growth mindset, they'll talk to us about being so understanding emotionally of their athletes, yet the athletes say to us that they don't feel supported, they don't necessarily feel that the coach is caring for them at the difficult points. So self-awareness, number one priority for our coaches, and that's self-regulation in terms of managing your own frustrations, particularly in and around the pressure. We know some of our coaches, and one of the challenges, and if you watch Netball Super League, it's on Sky this weekend, all day on Saturday, so if you're a football fan, tough. There are 4 games on, we're dominating one of the channels. One of the challenges for all of these Super League coaches, certainly the English ones, we've got a couple of overseas, but doing some work with them, we set them the challenge of not showing any emotion on the bench. So our team bench, now if you take the football, you take Arsene Wenger at the weekend, then the vent of emotion, you might say, well, that's just inevitable. Player gets sent off and, costs them the game. But actually, the impact of that emotion displayed is incredibly negative and can impact in all sorts of ways on the performers. And what we're trying to say to our coaches is it's almost deal with the winning, deal with the losing, deal with the frustration in a very measured way. And we're finding that the visual reading of a coach's emotion in terms of their performance on the bench is impacting upon some of our performers in netball in a negative way. And that to us is all in and around this notion of their managing their own emotions. So while ever they're saying they can read and support their athletes, then we're coming back almost to that previous model of number one, they're not managing their own emotions. So that will be the inhibiting factor all the way through their development as a coach. So we're almost bringing some of our coaches back to say, this is critical to be developed. And so that's just a real cue to us to say a lot of coaches in this system are really struggling to just manage themselves under pressure. So how on earth can they be as successful with those performers as well? There will be times when we all pull faces. I know that, and we know that in sport, but it's something for us to work on. And as I say, desperate that our coaches begin to move in that way. We work a lot on motivation with the coaches, so the fact that they actually can internalise their motivation, motivate others in a positive way, and we look very closely at how, and I'm sure you people do in terms of industry, how they goal set with a view to not necessarily being totally outcome focused, that there's always a backdrop. The backdrop is always measured by the process and the performance, that there's always an element to fall back on in terms of review in a positive way. Should you have lost the game, our coaches motivate their performers and are asked to very closely to ensure that the goals are set that can be measured and actually don't necessarily fall onto potentially the win-loss element. So motivation, building this idea of EI and the intelligence in and around performers can be impacted upon by the motivation and how you actually present your motives in and around competition. Empathy goes without saying. I think I've probably given you enough examples around sort of our rowing context and the pressure at the moment that our coaches do need to show empathy and need to be able to read in an athlete the timing and when they really do need to sort of probably take a step off in terms of the training load that they're putting on them or the capacity that athlete has at the time and just reduce their input. And social skills, the interpersonal nature of our coaches, we know from our athletes that they really value the relationship, the professional relationship they build with their coaches, and equally how that relationship manifests itself out of the training context. So it's not just about coaching and being the first-class individual in terms of delivery of a session. What we do know is our athletes take the coach and the input that they want with the coach and the support they want out into their lifestyle. So we're almost finding ourselves in a situation where the coach is actually becoming more involved out of session with some of these athletes. And I don't say that in a negative way. A lot of the out of session elements that need managing for the athlete are taking over a coach's time, or the upset that an athlete's facing, picking them up after a disappointment. That's where we're seeing all of our coaches really active, and that's where they report to us to say, I can't believe the amount of work I've actually got to do with these athletes out of session. So where we've got coaches that are driven technically and tactically and don't necessarily see the bigger picture of managing the athlete, managing them in terms of lifestyle, the support they offer emotionally out of the session, we're seeing some poor responses from athletes in terms of their judgment of that coach. So there's a lot for us to actually go on. I presented this yesterday. For us, we're just working with some of the top coaches, so we I did some work in and around a focus group of coaches, 9 coaches, 6 of which had actually been to more than 2 World Cup events or Commonwealth Games in netball. And I talked to them in and around this idea of emotional intelligence and just asked them, what qualities do you expect in a coach? You've been there, you've lived, you've been incredibly successful. And these were just some of the words that came out over and over again. And as we started to talk to coaches in equestrian, expert coaches, they were defined and selected accordingly. Again, the same kinds of messages came out. So we're tending to sort of use some of these quality reports just to use in terms of training to say this is what previous coaches have said. Self-awareness, as I've mentioned before, is our focus. And the management of change. And interestingly, that a lot of coaches that I work with in the early stages really struggle with the change processes. And sport is just on an evolving 4-year cycle. So if you can't cope with change, you're pretty much doomed. Because, and I'm guessing it might be the same in your industry, but we just don't know from one year to the next in sport, particularly netball, whether Sport England will give us the money they've said they're going to give us, or they'll take it away because participation numbers have gone down. So there's an expectation of getting, and in 2014 they turn around to say your numbers have gone down, you don't get. Now that can mean loss of resource for a coach. It could even be loss of personnel supporting the athlete and the coach themselves. So our coaches really need to be able to cope with this change process and the management of it and management of others in the situation. So 1 and 2 there, as I've said, are probably key focal points for us. Empathy, being curious, balanced, not perfectionists. So they were saying it's not about being a perfectionist. No one ever should say they are. It is just about being this individual that seeks out opportunities, that continues to grow and will make mistakes, but actually learn an awful lot from them. And there's an element of graciousness that sits with those individuals. This is just some of the work in and around cricket. We do manage a programme for the ECB at the university with their master coaches, all the coaches that sit in the academies or manage the academies, manage some of the top counties. This was a piece of research done. I still think there's scope for a lot more in sport, particularly in context of different sporting sort of programmes. But we know that, and we're being told that EI is a predictor of leadership level and capability. And we've got some of the key findings from this report just stated that the idea of coping in pressure situations did actually come out strong in this research as well. So we're getting confirmation of what we think, what we maybe picked up from the business world, what we're applying in sport is starting to feed itself through in context-specific research in our field. And as I've said, the regular emotional intelligence training is critical. The self-reporting of coaches will allow us to really keep working with them to grow this level of intelligence. Anyone heard of 70-20-10? Yesterday? Yes. Charles Jennings, Reuters. Yeah, great. We've taken it full on in sport. This came from business. Charles Jennings, if you've not heard of Charles Jennings, and led an awful lot in and around Reuters, lots of business sort of energy in and around the guy, and he presented, I think it's a decade old, this notion of 70-20-10. I think this is really critical for the future of coaching. Netball, they've adopted the 70-20-10 notion to take them into their next 4-year cycle with government bidding for support and funds for growing leadership, growing coaches. Fair to say, sport was predominantly 90%, where you see the 10, you could almost say that none of this happened very much, and this was about 90%. So formal learning dominated sport in a sense of trying to grow coaches. And it's only in the last probably 5 years that sports have started to say, we don't do an awful lot in and around the soft skills, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal development, the collaboration, the scenario building. And I think events like this are superb for you to share different experiences. Sport were just a little bit slow to see the benefit of it, or they were driven by performance targets and everything related to the technical and the tactical, or the physiological in terms of fitness of athletes. So sport are starting to hold on to this, to say it's more about experience. You will only develop your self-awareness, you will only develop your emotional intelligence by living, reflecting, and really getting to grips with on-the-job performance, the support that you're given, and that continued reflection and regulation in terms of the management of your emotional behaviour. So if we were to dwell and stay in the formal learning, we would never be in a situation where we can start to tap into the emotional capabilities of these individuals. So more experience, but measured and supported in a way of scenario building, looking more closely at emotional responses, emotional behaviour, the connection with others, the social learning, the peer learning, the coaching. Meaningful conversations we're tending to refer to mentoring as opposed to formal mentoring. We're trying to just encourage review, networking in and around critical incidents, all of which will place demands on the coaches to reflect in and around their emotional behaviour. So we're actually just using this as a very simple concept to go out to our coaches. We could go out with 6 theories of learning and we would just, they would switch off completely. I'm sure some of you people would as well. And what we're finding is this is just resonating with a mass of workforce out there that and if our top coaches can advocate this kind of approach and live it, we know that will start to cascade through. So all of our coaches will be led down this path of, yes, you need your formal qualifications, your education, but equally it's what you then do with it, and it's how you build that capacity emotionally in emotional intelligence to match the IQ and the sport-specific expertise that you have. So it might give a whole new meaning to the E factor, but experience, exposure, education is pretty much our sort of mantra moving forwards, which I think is great. Another idea, just before I pass over to you, is the levelling. So I mentioned a little bit at the beginning about the model and how we scaffold it, sort of learning to know what your own emotions are, your responses, moving it into that eventual position of being able to predict other people's responses and almost manage the situation to avoid certain negative emotions becoming apparent. Then some of the researchers sort of said it comes in 2 stages, that if you've got an individual in a leadership position that can get along with everybody, that's built the relationships, that's got this strong ethos in and around teamwork, that is empowering, and I often call this leadership from behind as opposed to leadership from in front, that you've empowered staff, you've empowered those that you work with, then you've got the foundation, and this was a piece of work in business being applied in sport now, and then you've got capacity to really get ahead. And they're almost saying that if you're not seeing leaders build the teamwork, the empowering approach in terms of individuals, and certainly the empowerment principles feature an awful lot in coaching. If you were ever coached or actually just engaged in extracurricular sport at school, you could probably remember being shouted at and abuse hurled at you in awful cold weather, which is often people's report when I talk to them. But we really do try to use an awful lot of the empowering principles, holistic principles in and around sport now. So I hope if you are involved or you've got sons, daughters, relatives involved, you don't see a coach shouting continually at performers, because that's not what sport's advocating. So we build this, the teamwork, the empowering approach, and then it opens up the doors to be visionary, to be creative, to be able to innovate, and almost a greater rewarding environment. So that's a piece of research that's just trying to say, what does this look like on the ground, and what are the behaviours in the first instance that a leader should be really working on to then enhance their capacity even further. So I said I'd talk a little bit about football. I did want to put a netballer there, but I'm going to use this example. This is a situation, and I wanted to present this to you. This is a situation that we present to our coaches. It's one of our scenarios, and just so I keep you engaged, I'm going to give you the next one. I will ask you, what is your workplace goalkeeper moment? So just keep that at the back of your minds. That will be your discussion point in a second. So we've got a situation here. So FA Cup, you probably know this scenario, you've lived it with one of your football teams, but we've got a football team. They're expected to qualify to the next round of the FA Cup, and 91st minute, the goalkeeper fumbles the ball and makes the biggest mistake of his life. Goal is scored. This team were on the way to qualifying. They were expected to go forward in the competition. This goalkeeper makes the biggest mistake, lets the ball in the net. You can imagine the crowd, you can imagine the rest of the team, and you can probably imagine what the coach is actually thinking. So my question to you is, just for the next 5 minutes, what would the emotionally intelligent coach do? So I just want to leave that with you and see what your thoughts are. So I am pulling you out of your own context, but I'm sure you've all lived that moment at some point. It's a scenario we use with our coaches, and I used recently with some of the leaders at Sports Coach UK. So what do you expect the emotionally intelligent coach did? This is what the coach did, and it will resonate with some of the comments, and as I've said, it's a scenario we use because we do know that some of our coaches don't necessarily handle those situations as well as they should do. Important to continue to follow your protocol that you always follow post-match. If you take my example of a coach on the bench, when our coaches go through a loss that they don't expect, all of their post-match protocol goes to pieces, or can do, and we're saying no, maintain your protocol. What you always do, what your routine is, maintain it. So the coach followed the protocol. Try to slow the energy, because what happened, the disappointment went to frustration, and the frustration went to players being very angry. So it's sensing the shift in emotion, which for somebody, that capacity to do that and recognise that that's happening. So actually slowing the energy, keeping fairly quiet, keeping fairly calm, not necessarily doing anything any different in terms of the changing room that they're not used to. Visually making sure that there's a calmness as opposed to some anger or heavy stepping in and around the changing room and so on. So the coach addressed the team when he sensed that the level of frustration or hype or energy in the room had sort of lowered itself a little bit more, which is sort of coming out in what you said. Lowered speech rate. We talk a lot to coaches about just thinking about how you present the information, lowering your tone, just lowering and slowing down what you're saying in those moments. Trying just to invoke the calm. Highlights the positives of the game, brings the team together, united in a sense of saying they've worked hard to date, they've got an awful lot of past experience and success to really use in moving forwards, and really outlines the fact that the coach is available, and gentle nudge to the goalkeeper to say, if you need to discuss anything, then I'm around, but not necessarily exposing the situation and making it more of a difficult situation for any of those players, particularly the goalkeeper. So, what is your moment? So what is your workplace goalkeeper moment? Don't say which one and how long have you got. I just would like to know if you could present, if you've got an idea, and obviously we've not got a lot of time left, but what would be your goalkeeper moment that you would want your staff to really try and handle, be better at? Okay, I posed a question yesterday to the group, and just sort of we toy with this idea in terms of interviewing now, that we don't have the psychometrics. I know that is a logical answer, but how can we tease out in interview this idea of how emotionally intelligent some of our coaches are? And there are community coaches that work with youngsters that you want to show a good level of emotional intelligence. That's just as critical as at the top level for maintaining engagement in sport and physical activity. So we're actually really working hard to look at, okay, some of the questions that you might pose could be in and around or presenting scenarios. So we talked a little bit yesterday about, what might those questions be, and one of the questions that we always ask our interviewers, people working within England Netball, are questions around, who inspires you and why, what are the reasons? And it's incredible what that gives us back about the person that is being interviewed. It doesn't give us everything, and you always take some risks, but what we're trying to do is say, okay, we want the emotionally intelligent coach, so how do we know that they are in our sort of short interview processes that we go through for part-time work, to some extent volunteering work. We've got interview processes in place. So that's actually a flavour of where we're at in terms of netball sport as a whole, from the university perspective, in and around the Olympic sports we work with as well. I hope that's been useful. It's a snapshot tour of where the work is moving in sport, and if you can take just one element of that away, and perhaps it prompts some thinking in and around what you might do with your staff, then I hope it's been of use. I'll leave it there, I think, before I get dragged away.